Good. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing this space with us. My name is Manpreet. Please call me Manpreet Dilawar, and I use pronouns she and her. And I'm here with the Universal Human Rights Initiative. And we are a small nonprofit that tackles big things around social justice and human rights education through using an intergroup dialogue approach. And I'm here with the Executive Director of UHRI, Rebecca Canara. So I'm going to pass it on to her to briefly introduce herself. And we'll also ask if you can introduce yourself in the chat, and we'll get started in a little bit. And that just makes sure that you have the chat available as well, because we'll use that throughout the session.
Yeah, so hello everybody. I'm Rebecca Canara. My pronouns are she and her. And as I'm speaking, let me just let this person in the room. As I'm speaking, if you want to just use the chat to greet each other, maybe you all already know each other and we're the only new people in the room. We don't know, but just send in a little hello on the chat, who you are, how you are today. Universal Human Rights Initiative does a few things, and we won't go into it in big detail, but just to say we're connected to HRE USA and so grateful for all the partnership we've had so far with them and with Kaylee and Christy, because we just really believe in human rights education. And what we're going to do with you today is give you a sense of the intergroup dialogue work that we do at UHRI, so that when we are promoting human rights, we are getting more and more comfortable and motivated to have difficult conversations that allow us to stand up for human rights and against discrimination. And so I'll hand it off to Manpreet.
Thank you. So we're just putting some things, we're just asking you to introduce yourself in the chat, where you're calling in from. And we do want to start with just acknowledging, of course, the land that we're occupying, the labor that we're all benefiting from, but also that there's a lot going on in the world right now around us, personally, globally, nationally, that we're joining this conversation with. So I want to start by just sharing that at UHRI, we are actively acknowledging that we are benefiting from occupying ancestral lands of Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of Tongva, on whose ancestral lands that we reside, gather, and pray. I'm particularly on lands of Serrano people right now, also in Southern California. But we just want to say that land acknowledgements don't exist in past tense, right, or in historical context. So we really want to thank and honor all of the ancestors and their descendants here today, and the contributions of all of our relatives, past, present, and future. We also want to honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black life, knowledge, and skills, but stolen due to violence and white supremacy, especially when we think about the United States context. So collectively at UHRI and all of our communities are saying that police and white violence must end. Black lives matter. And we also honor all immigrant and indigenous labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented people who contributed to the building of the United States as a country and continue to serve within our labor force. So I want to ask us to just commit to take what we learn here today and incorporate it into our daily lives and really try to turn our words into action. And we'll introduce in a little bit what the goals for today are of this dialogue. But I also want to ask us just join in taking a moment to honor the land, life, and labor of the Indigenous, Black, and immigrant communities where we reside. And right now, there is a lot of pain and suffering in the world. Whether it is what's going on with the war in the Middle East, with more climate disasters and earthquakes in Asia and near us, whether it's sociopolitical harm that's being done locally for us, or individual things that are happening, there's just a lot of pain and suffering. So I want to acknowledge first for that we want you to bring in difficult conversations. That's the goal here. But we only have limited time together. So we're not going to be able to process everything, especially something as big as if we bring in Palestine and Israel and Gaza right now. So we want to welcome those dialogues, but with the mindset that we can't, that we can't just have that conversation in 2 hours. So what I do want to ask us to do is just take the metaphor, find your feet. So really thinking about it as a metaphor. Our mind might be in many different places. I'm thinking about my little ones right now. It might be in many different places. So let's just take a breather and ground ourselves. Literally think about where you are. Bring yourself in this moment the best that you can. So let's just take a moment, bring yourself to this space, find your feet, ground yourself, and then we'll get started. Thank you again for sharing this space with us.
Thank you so much, Manpreet. So as we get started, we want to just share our goals in this time that we have together. And so the focus is how do we facilitate difficult conversations? And so we want to cover a few tools and give you some time to practice using those tools. And these all are coming from our intergroup dialogue work. So the concept of brave space, the way that we can introduce some best practices, at least through our experience, to moderate a difficult conversation, where we really use a lot of self-reflection, whether that's about privilege, conflict management, understanding our own connections to conflict, inquiry-based questioning, perspective taking, what we mean by calling in versus calling out, and understanding intent versus impact. And then, like I said, we're going to take some time to actually practice facilitating some very mini difficult dialogues. Any questions from anyone before I get started? No? Okay. Okay, great.
Rebecca,
So,
for
yeah.
this next part, just so you know, it looks like Laura on the screen is also with Dave. So for this next, just for us
Oh,
to get you started as a check-in, let's not put them into a breakout room
okay. So
because
you
y'all
two,
can dialogue together.
thank you for that. Okay, great. So that helps me because I'm quietly building little breakout rooms on my own here. So why don't you describe,
Yeah.
I'll fix the breakout rooms.
Yeah. So one of the things that's like really key for any sort of dialogue, but especially when difficult conversations come up, is we need to feel heard, right? And we really need to actively listen so the other person feels heard. So we want to take a moment just to have you all share and do a brief check-in, but also ask you to practice really just actively listening. So we're going to send you into a breakout room, ask you to pair share, just share with one other person, and take turns to actively listen to each other without interrupting, right? When they're done, you can just take a moment to validate the feelings that you heard. You don't need to give advice. You don't need to respond in any way. Just try to validate what you heard. So, what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to share something that you value about the work that you do, or share something that you value about connecting with others. Something you value about connecting with others. So, let you think about that for a moment. We're going to send you into a breakout room. We're just going to ask you to take turns sharing either something you value about the work you do or something that you value about connecting with others. Any questions before we send you into breakout rooms?
How much time do we have for the breakout room?
So just
Yeah, good question.
7 minutes. Okay, I'm going to open the rooms and we'll see you in a little bit. Okay, welcome back, everyone.
Hi. So, Michaela and Lydia just came back and said it was good. Feel free to use the reactions on Zoom as well. And that virtual interactions can be challenging. What else? If anyone's willing to share, yeah, the value of human connection. So Michaela's saying in the chat also, like it's really highlighted the value of human connection. Did anyone share something that you value about the work that you do? What do you value about the work you do?
I shared something. I have someone banging on the door for me, but I shared that I really love working in an extremely diverse place. So my neighborhood's not necessarily that way, but being able to enter into a workspace where my organization is made up of completely different languages, different nationalities, different countries of origin, as well as serving a population who is also that way. And so I gain a lot of value from learning from them and seeing resiliency and beauty and creation in a lot of different ways that I wish I had in my home community, but I don't.
Thank you for sharing that, Kaylee. Do you appreciate the diversity, especially value the diversity of folks that you get to work with? Anyone else? Any other values you want to share with the group? It's always important to start on a positive note, right? Like remember what we value about our work.
I'll sneak in Manpreet because I get to work with Manpreet, so that's one of my favorite parts. But what's valuable to me about the work we do, especially in dialogue, is that I still haven't, since we've been doing this work since 2015, I don't know, 2015, I think. I haven't yet been in a dialogue where I didn't learn something, where it didn't feel valuable, no matter the size, large or small. And I really, really appreciate that about the work we're doing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rebecca. And can I just, you can unmute or you can just use the reactions. How many of you felt listened to by your partner, like heard? You felt heard. I'm going to go back to what Lydia has said and Michaela said, online interactions can be hard, but I appreciate the reactions. But you felt heard. So whatever that feeling was, whatever your partner did to make you feel heard, we want to continue that throughout the rest of our time together, especially because this is about difficult conversations, right? So the first step is we want to make sure that we feel that our partners feel heard, right? And we don't have to agree, but we just want to make sure that they feel heard so that we can learn something new. And that's where what we also want to do is we want to cultivate a brave space together. And this is really a tool used for intergroup dialogue as well, where we're not able to guarantee you a safe space. I can't guarantee that you're going to feel safe in this setting, right? But also that we need to feel brave to learn something new. So I'm going to pass it on to Rebecca to take us through some intergroup dialogue ground setting tools for the conversation that we're going to have.
Yeah, thank you. So as Manpreet starts to share the slides, we have some ways in which we frame our conversations, even if we're just coming in for an hour together, because we've seen it really matters. We need to be able to lean on that, especially when there are difficult conversations. And so one of the things we really like to talk about first is, as Manpreet said, there's a lot of things around courageous conversations, safe space. We really in intergroup dialogue talk about brave space. So it's our personal understanding of where I'm at in my learning edge, where do I feel comfortable and safe and stay? Where do I push myself to be a little bit more vulnerable and stretch? And we call that brave space. And often the discomfort that comes with that can be where we have some learning. But when we're entering something like this and it's recording and all of that, we may be starting from our panic zone, right? There's times when people enter conversations, when they're in conversations with us, they know that we're going to be talking about all the isms of discrimination, right? So there's a lot of people who have experienced discrimination. It's going to bring up painful pieces for them, like painful experiences for them. So they may be entering in their panic zone. And so we're not asking you to stay in that zone. And so one of the things we always highlight and emphasize is self-care and thinking about checking in with yourself first. How am I doing? How am I feeling right now? What do I need? What needs do I need met right now? So that I can actually meet everyone in this brave space as best I can. And everyone's brave space is totally different than the next. And there's no judgment. It's you're showing up however you can show up today. And so I'm going to move us to the next slide. One of the other things we talk about is always having some type of community agreement. And so this is a tool we use. This Aspire tool is one of our go-tos for when we have a short session together. If your group could create it itself before you're holding any difficult conversation, we definitely support and encourage that, because we want it driven from the actual people, participants in the dialogue. And so this is an example, though, of a tool you can lean on. And so I'm going to just walk through it quickly and know that there's a handout that you'll have as well with all of this. But assuming good intention. So we assume good intention when people are coming together, but we don't stay in that space. We take accountability personally for any negative impact. If I say something and it hurts Manpreet's feeling and she says ouch or oops or whatever, or she says ouch to me in the chat or wherever, I'm going to circle back with her, whether it's appropriate in the moment or after, so that I can have my oops moment. I can honor that I had an impact on her and I can learn from that mistake, right? And no one's perfect. And I have a lot of blinders in my world in terms of all of the ways that the bubbles and privileges I've grown up with. And so it's just a piece of engaging with each other, especially as we go into difficult conversations. Sharing airtime, noticing if you're someone who takes a lot of space or hardly any space on an online Zoom, for example, or in a one-on-one versus 10 people in a meeting. Notice just how you often show up and see if you can stretch there as well to take less space or more space, depending on who you are. Practice your active listening. We'll do a bit of that today, and you did a bit just now. And we just say lean in with empathy. Notice body language, listen with your heart, your mind, your ears, all, so that we are really actively listening to someone and taking in what they have to say. Especially in a difficult conversation, lean on I statements. So, I feel this, I am experiencing this, instead of people think this, or people are like this, or this group, I'm going to group together. Just make sure at all times you're really leaning into that I statement and speaking from your experience. In my experience, I feel this way. That goes a long way to keeping the conversation focused. Respecting the confidentiality of the conversation. So I know we're recording today, and that's going to stay within the group that's going through this whole series together. Often in our dialogues, because they're difficult, we don't record, because we say, we'll respect your confidentiality, though I may be moved by something you share. I'll definitely take that with me. We want you to take those stories with you. We just leave the names and identities behind in the room, in the Zoom room, or wherever you are. And then really to highlight that everyone's an expert of their own experience. Like, intergroup dialogue is really about bringing your experience, personal or professional, all together, and really prioritizing that as how we learn together. You're an expert in the room of who you are and what you know, and we want to learn from you. And so then one of the questions we have is this something that sounds good to you for going forward today? But first of all, are there any additions or changes, any reactions anyone in this room right now is having to the bullets I just shared? And you can use the chat. Just wondering if there's anything you want to emphasize, change, add, or or any questions? Okay. Oh, yeah, Lydia.
Oh, I've heard discussion around assume good intent. Have you heard discussion around that as well?
Yeah.
That doesn't always serve us.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's sort of why why you see us take accountability, because sometimes there are not good intentions. Sometimes when we have a moment where somebody says something and they feel like they have good intentions, but maybe it's uninformed, ignorant, hurtful, whatever it is. And then there's a facilitator or as just a person, I'm interrupting it. If just notice if you're being confronted with that feedback, if you're focused on proving your good intention, then you're kind of missing the point, right? And so that's why we really talk about leaning into the accountability piece. We want, everyone to understand. I'm sure we can start from okay, we're here with good intentions, but there could be a rupture. That's normal. It happens. It's how we then learn together. And so we have to lean into that accountability. And accountability means hearing how it hurt somebody else and learning for the why behind that, if that person's comfortable doing so. Otherwise, we can process it differently.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else, any questions or comments? Okay. So then I think if you want to use the reactions again, if we can get a thumbs up or hand clap, whatever works for you, is this something we can agree to for moving forward today? That's how we engage with each other. A heart, I like that. That works. Got thumbs up. Yay, great. Okay. And the seam, hopefully that works for you as well. Okay, well, we'll move forward. So let's go to the next slide. And so some of the tools that we use in intergroup dialogue, we've just discussed, right? Community agreements, brave space. We have a tool about actively listening called Lara, and it's in the handout. And we're going to just give you some time to practice a bit of it using some additional tools specific to facilitators. We're also going to talk about the privilege knapsack, some other examples that we could have hour-long dialogues on. The privilege knapsack being one, intent versus impact and interrupting bias, all different examples of things that we talk about and focus on in intergroup dialogue and really unpack over time in a series that we do, for example. So we'll share the handout with the group, but this QR code is for you also. If you wanted to see it now, you can, take your phone and access it. That'll be available to you forever and ever. And we can go to the next slide. And so what we want to start with is thinking about, okay, before I even enter the difficult conversation, what's going on with me as a facilitator, right? So what's my own relationship to conflict? What are my own triggers? Do I understand, the difference between intent and impact? Am I able to talk about that and unpack that a bit? And what privileged identities do I hold that may be influencing how I'm perceiving what's going on in any difficult conversation? And so these are all things that intergroup dialogue facilitators, for example, reflect on and share with each other as they enter into dialogues. And we always have 2 facilitators minimum, so that different intersectional identities are represented by the facilitators that hopefully represent more and more of the people that are in the dialogue. And so we're going to start with the relationship to conflict. So I'm going to ask you to just, if you're willing to unmute and share out, but you can use the chat, I'd like you to just finish the sentence, conflict is. Conflict is what? And the first words that come to mind. Don't give me your I think I should say this. Conflict is. Anyone want to unmute and share? Conflict is nothing to be scared of. All right. Thank you, Michaela. What else? It's okay if you have a totally different response. Anything? You can use the chat. Conflict is something to be avoided. Yes, thank you. That's a very common. Conflict is hard. Yeah. Any last one? Conflict arises through differences. Yeah, thank you. So what we want to do is just sort of think about that, right? How do I respond? What is like my go-to implicit response to it? And what we want to emphasize, and it's unavoidable. Thank you. Thank you, Nassim. Yeah, and a couple, yeah, supported by the whole group. So while we know that a lot of us lean towards wanting to avoid conflict, we may have had bad experiences with conflict. And so now that's going to impact how we encounter conflict the next time. And that's part of why it can feel hard. And that those differences can be hard to navigate. I want to just uplift Michaela's response, but it's nothing to be scared of. We'll be okay, right? We know that that's not always the case. And so part of it is engaging with when is it safe and when isn't it? But what we're in intergroup dialogue, we're talking about conflict as an opportunity, right? We're talking about conflict as something we can lean into and invest in each other to learn from each other as how did this emerge and why, and take really time to have an open-ended, let's let go of me trying to convince you. I'm not going to try to debate you and find holes in your story. I need to just take in what you're saying. I'm not going to interrupt. I'm really going to take it in, and it may move me to have a different understanding over time. And I may be able to do the same for you. And so that's the opportunity that we're thinking about when we talk about conflict. And at the same time, we have triggers, right? There are things that come up. So Manpreet, if you can go to the next slide. We have, we define triggers right now, at least today here, as words, behaviors, experiences, or content that stimulate emotional responses because of their painful, negative, or demeaning associations. And so one thing to just say is in conflict, there's this idea of, has anyone heard of this 90-10 concept? Is that familiar to anybody? Okay. One of the ways we talk about it is that 90% of a conflict may actually just be about everything that you've experienced before, or some aspect of your experience being triggered, being brought up, and that 10% is the actual issue at hand. And that helps to sort of, maybe shift a bit just the weight of the conflict in front of you in the moment, in the dialogue, and whatever it is. And so part of the importance is for each of us to reflect, whether we're just in conflict with someone or facilitating a difficult conversation, right? How do I react when I see this happen in front of me or it happens to me? What are my triggers? What's going on in my body? What do I need from me? And so to stay with that part of self-reflection, right? We have this suggestion of 3 levels of reflecting. So reflect on your own personal reaction, right? What are you feeling and why? Consider what's going on with the other person, right? And how you might be able to add your perspective and share with them. But what's also happening with anyone who's witnessing, anyone in the group? What's happening with that group dynamic? And that's important, of course, for the facilitators. But as a parent, I can tell you, it comes up for me also there, right? Like what's going on for whoever, the other parent in the room maybe, and then the conflict that's happening between the siblings, or it can be anything. So to take time to notice and reflect on that, and not just give into urgency of trying to solve the problem. And so dialogue is about that slower pause. Manpreet, I see you unmuting.
Yeah, I really appreciate you, Rebecca, bringing up your parenting example as well, because this isn't just in navigating difficult conversations in the workplace or in education settings or in human rights settings. I think it applies to a lot of our different life situations. So really thinking about, I want to highlight what Rebecca was saying, realizing that, okay, if I'm feeling triggered right now, okay, what is that trigger about, right? And knowing that this is an intense reaction, then 90% of the reaction might be from something that's happened before, and 10% of it might be from what just happened right now. So for example, when I get microaggressed and someone just comes up to me, hey, what are you? My reaction might be really terrible, but it's not because, oh, this person just said, what are you? What are they trying to get? What's their intention? Oh, they want to know, where am I from, or what's my ethnicity? But the impact it has, that I feel othered because previously I've been othered, I've been excluded by people, just and dehumanized, not felt like a human, because people just say, what are you, to try to put me in a box, right? So realizing that, my own personal reaction, and knowing what's going on, I can be more aware. But also when we're in group settings, especially if we're meeting with people more than one time, this is the community that we're part of, communicating what that trigger is to others when we get comfortable with it, or making space, creating a brave space where other folks can speak to their triggers so they can be processed, can really help us pay attention to what's going on. Because when we have that intense reaction, it's harder to pay attention. But we also need to be really mindful of what was the intention versus the impact, and really make sure, like Rebecca had said, part of the Aspire tool, we want to make sure we're taking accountability for that impact. As a facilitator, we're making space for there to be a dialogue, for open conversation around that impact, or even at least just acknowledgement around that impact. And I think that comes up a lot in my personal relationship, right? Even like, hey, the tone you were using just shut me down. Or, yes, your intention might have been just to ask me something, but the impact it had needs to be taken into account.
All right. So thank you, Manpreet. I love that you built on that, because it's so crucial. And we're really, again, showing you things that you could spend an hour talking with people about. So in your settings, if it's appropriate, take these, we'll share the slides, take these ideas and unpack them together with people. So similar to what we talked about, intent versus impact, I think we started to cover it, right? And so this is an example of an exercise you can do to get at that more. And so for this, we're just sharing again this slide in terms of, like, one thing that we hear a lot is, I don't see color, we're all just human, right? And so just to take a moment to reflect, okay, what are some possible positive intentions from that? Okay, how can I see that what you just said is positive from your perspective? And you can, I don't know, anyone have any ideas for why someone might say that from a positive perspective? Again, chat or unmute is fine.
I think speaking from a personal perspective, because I do have, I will say, some more conservative family, and I think sometimes there tends to be confusion with this new generation, aka mine, compared to, let's say, like my mom, who's in her later 40s, this whole new idea of like being woke. So to kind of, I guess, go with the times or fit in with the lingo, that's something that I've definitely heard. And then as like a correction, and having that conversation of like maybe why we shouldn't say that, I've gotten pushback because of the confusion of like, well, I thought that's what I was supposed to say, type of thing. So I think that sometimes can definitely play a role, as the differing in the simplest just difference in generation.
Thank you for that. Anyone else? One more positive reason someone might say we're all just human.
Yeah, Nassim also put in the chat, but they might think that this means that we're all equal. So really trying to get at the equality. And I think, Michaela, what I heard from you also with the generational differences, oh, I'm trying to communicate that we're all the same, we're all good, we're all human, we're all equal, right? Similar to that, but not realizing that that might have a different impact.
Yeah. And so what about the negative impacts? What's a potentially negative impact from the saying? Yeah, denying discrimination. Thank you, Nassim. Right? It's denying that maybe you value that your value is that we're all equal, but not everyone's experiencing everything equally. People are being discriminated against. Opportunities look different for different people. Yeah, thank you. So,
I saw Lydia also unmuted.
oh,
Did you
thank
have
you,
something
Lydia.
to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, like a really good example of being gaslit.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't see the structure that we're all, managing or trying to manage and how it affects people unequally, then, you have a lot of work to do. And that's going to make people feel unseen and their experience as, being discounted.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And and getting at that those kinds of that kind of approach, that kind of the gaslighting or the different perspectives, that's definitely where you start to enter then a difficult conversation, right? And so one last slide to just show you before we go into some more dialogue together. Is to think then, okay, so then has anyone seen this before? Actually, I'm going to ask that first. And the invisible knapsack, is that it's been around for so long. Does anyone know? It's new to some people. Okay. So Peggy McIntosh created the white privilege unpacking the invisible knapsack. That was, I think, in the 70s, right, Manpreet? I think.
Yeah, so this is just one way of reflecting on our own privileges.
Yeah. And so the original one versus now, there's a lot, maybe there's more awareness and different things that we're talking about, but what is it? What are things that what are aspects of our identity that are privileged, right? Because they're part of the more dominant group in society. So if I walked through all these different examples, for example, of race, ethnicity, gender, age, ability status, economic status, religion, sexual orientation, et cetera, right? I can really look and think about how many privileged identities I'm carrying around with me wherever I go. And some of them, maybe in certain contexts, they're more privileged, in certain contexts, they're not, right? So, in certain identities, you can just read by looking at me, and certain identities I can conceal and not share with you unless I choose to. And so, we just want you to take a moment. You can use some of the categories listed to the right of the screen and just think about some privileged identities you may hold and how they may impact you and people who don't hold those same identities. This is, again, we could do that for an hour together. Today, we're just asking you to take a moment to reflect personally. So just take a moment, maybe write it down. You don't have to share them out loud in the chat or anything. Just write them down and reflect, because then you can carry them forward with you in whatever space you're in.
And I think just to give an example, one of the ways that these impact us and others who don't hold the same identities, especially when it comes to us practicing or having difficult conversations, is we don't really know what's going on for them or what their upbringing was like or what their socialization was like, right? So for me, for example, I don't have a physical disability. So when I'm thinking about things like even earlier, now I'm very, very aware of them, but because I am right now physically able-bodied, even coming up with the example earlier of saying, hey, using the metaphor, find your feet. That's assuming that everyone has feet on the ground, right? Or that's excluding people who might be using a wheelchair to get around, or that might be excluding people who really can't even walk around. So thinking about the privileges that we have help us identify what are the things that I might be missing? Who am I not bringing into the conversation? And what do I need to do to really bring them into the conversation? So one of the things is when you have these dialogues in English, I know that that's excluding a lot of people that in the United States, for example, who can't really have these challenging conversations in English. So knowing that I'm an English speaker and that's a privilege that I hold, or that I have a US passport now, that's a privilege I hold, especially in other areas of the world, I can truly think about the impact that my privileges might have on who I'm leaving behind, or who I really need to include and bring in to the conversation.
Yeah. And from a human rights perspective, I'm a cisgender female identifying person. And so there's so many ways that right now, all these assaults on transgender rights, I can tune them out because I think they don't apply to me. Right. And I might not feel as invested because I know it's not going to impact me. But there are people I love who it does impact, right? And so that brings me into that. But the more time or I spend isolated from anybody, or the intergroup piece is about making sure we're really looking at who are we in contact with on a daily basis. How does that intergroup experience look so that I do feel invested in everyone in my community and beyond?
Anyone else want to bring up what you're thinking about, or anything about thinking about our privileges, the dominant identities we hold? And again, feel free to use the chat, but we wanted you to really think through these different aspects, really just reflect on them, right? What are our approaches to conflict? Do we think about it as an opportunity? Do we think about it as something that we can't avoid, right? Unavoidable? Do we think about it as something that's really hard? And how that might shape how we enter in difficult conversations and what triggers we have. And we need to reflect on and be aware of what are the different things that are really going to bring up that intense reaction for me. And how can I bring in other people while I'm having that intense reaction to some certain things that are triggers for me? And we need to be very clear about intent versus impact. It's important to think about the intentions, but we also need to take accountability for the impact our words and actions have on others, especially when we're having difficult conversations. And it's not enough to just say, oh, I'm so sorry, like that's terrible. Yes, apologize, but let's be accountable. Let's figure out what we need to do and learn from those, from the impact that we have going forward. And finally, we all are bringing lots of different identities to every space we're in, right? So we're much more aware of the different marginalized identities we have, but let's also think about, especially when we're talking about difficult conversations around human rights, what are the dominant identities I hold, and how is that shaping the experiences that I have with different people? So thinking through all of these different pieces, we just had you reflect on, right? And we can go deeper into any of those for much, much more time. We're going to ask us to just do a group-wide dialogue because we're a smaller group, so this is great. Again, feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself. For this first question, I am going to ask you to just drop things into the chat as they come up. So you can list multiple things. What are some themes in human rights that you have found really challenging to talk about in your circles? So one thing I heard from Michaela earlier is woke culture, right? Or anti-woke culture. Let's just drop things in the chat. What are the themes in human rights that you have found challenging to talk about in your circles? Yeah, so let's just drop things in. So we're just asking folks to drop things in the chat of what are things that you're having a hard themes in human rights that you found challenging to talk about in your own circles. So LGBTQ plus, absolutely. I think personally for me, it's transgender rights, especially with family. Human rights and education, race, or specifically critical race theory, genocides, Israel-Palestine, current war in the Middle East. Anything else? That you have found is hard for you to talk about in your circles? Yeah, current events in Israel-Palestine. I think especially because I'm raising 2 young boys of color, one of whom has long hair. Gender comes up so much in my own circles, and transgender rights, and really having your own, power to choose. So that's personally a thing for me. And I really appreciate that a lot of folks are bringing up other things. Talked about woke culture, women's rights, human rights and education, critical race theory, and especially what's happening right now in Israel-Palestine. Voting rights. So there's a lot of different things that can be challenging. And I think especially when we're setting up a conversation about facilitating these difficult conversations using intergroup dialogue tools, there's things we need to do first to just prepare for the conversation. These are the things we just went through. So we talked about what creating a brave community space looks like, especially even if it's, one-on-one, but especially if it's a community space, which means that we can't really guarantee safety for anyone, right? You have to decide your own level of risk that you take in bringing up your point of view, but creating a space where folks feel like, okay, I can push beyond my comfort zone and really push into my learning more, learning edges, but not go into a panic zone where I feel like, oh no, I just can't, I just overshared, or I just don't feel like I'm doing, I can handle this conversation. So really creating that brave space for yourself, encouraging and modeling perspective taking. And we do that especially by listening, actively listening with empathy, understanding intent versus impact. So we might have the best intentions, but realizing the impact that might have. We've talked a lot about this, and taking accountability for that impact. And realizing what our own privileges are. What are we bringing into each space? And what are our triggers as they relate to different situations? So with all of these things we're seeing, so I'm seeing more things in the chat, like some context. So Nassim, you're from Iran, living in exile in Canada. Oof. Thank you for sharing that. So mistreatment of prisoners and torture, because sometimes it makes people super emotional and not that they don't care about. You're getting some love from folks. Just thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's hard to bring things up, especially when someone is stressed or experiencing their own challenges, or you might experience triggers. So when we want to hold a difficult conversation, we have to first just name the problem and agree on it. But we also need to create a space where there's trust, so we can have inclusion space for all voices. And that's what we want to do by using our community agreements and really sticking to those, using I statements. We're sticking to talking about our own personal experiences, how I'm feeling, or what I have gone through, or what I'm experiencing. Because in intergroup dialogue, every single person is an expert bringing your own experience. Because we are an intergroup, we're learning from each other. So no one can tell you you're wrong, right? In your own experience, because it's your experience. So sticking to that we're going to ask us to use certain tools that we'll introduce to you, in addition to the things we've gone through. And we do want to ask folks to stick to the community agreements. And I know, Laura, you just joined again. So if you could check in the chat, just make sure, chat us if you're okay with those, if you have questions, okay. But here's what we can do is when we're having difficult conversations, especially when this is about personal experiences for folks, or these are challenging things around human rights, we want to engage in what's called mindful inquiry, which really starts first with listening. And hi, I think someone just joined us. So you're joining at a perfect time because we're introducing this tool, and then we're going to get into smaller breakout rooms to try and practice it. So we're going to leave this up when we send you into breakout rooms so you can practice. But at the essence of this is that when we're having difficult conversations, we want to make sure that we are first just listening. We want to make sure that the other person feels heard, right? Even if it's something you don't agree with. If you just start going straight to, well, I disagree because, or that didn't make sense because, that's going to raise their, raise the conflict, raise the triggers, like really make them put them on the defensive. But if we can find something where we're just listening and truly showing that we're interested in learning about their experience by inquiring and engaging in this mindful inquiry before we respond, that calls that person into the conversation. Now, of course, there's times when you can't, it's not a time for dialogue. There's no space for, you just do need to shut people off. But especially when we're willing to learn, we want to hold these difficult conversations. We want to first listen, inquire, and then respond when it comes to human rights issues. So we're going to send you into breakout rooms. We're going to ask you to just think about a situation and try role playing with one person acting as the person who's going to do the thing and another person who's going to try listening and using mindful inquiry. But we're going to leave this up so you can first just reflect back on what's being said, use their words, not yours. That's number one. So you can use some things like what I heard you say was, right? On the right-hand side of this column, there's some suggestions for you to use to really be curious and open to what they're saying, emotionally relate to what they're feeling. We can relate to their feelings, even if we disagree with what's going on, right? And then try to understand how the past might affect what's going on for them right now, and really stay with the process rather than thinking about solutions. That's where we're really being mindful and inquiring. And then you can respond with whatever you want, right? First, we really want to do due diligence to inquire where this is coming from and learn more. So Rebecca, do you want to introduce the role play?
Yeah, so maybe we'll keep oh, you're good. Okay, so I know a couple of you just joined, and that is actually just fine. I have special roles for each of you. So let me just make sure I have enough people in each room, but sorry, but there we go. So what we're doing is you're going to role play for a moment one of the hard a conversation that's difficult for you. So somebody just pick an event, kind of do it quickly. It's just pick one, and one of you is going to be the person who you disagree with. So I would recommend that the person who picks the event is that person. And you play the person you would normally disagree with because you've heard it, you're trying to process these feelings that you're having. So just try to play that other perspective. The other person then role plays a different opinion from the first person, and one person just observes what's happening. Does that make sense? So one of you is just going to observe, and we're going to hear out a little bit afterwards some of what you observed. Does that make sense? Just making sure that this feels... Role playing is always an interesting one. The pressure to act. Okay, so you're going to have 10 minutes together. If you do it and you've solved the issue and whatever, and you just want to take time to talk about how that was for you, great. There's no wrong conversation that you could have in that room. Okay. If you need to process it a different way just because of who's in the room and what people need, that's okay as well. Just see if you can take a moment to practice hearing something you don't, listening, inquiring, and responding. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll keep this. I'm going to see if I can share it to the room while you're in there. Any
Yeah,
questions?
so as soon as you get to the room, just decide who wants to be which person. Do you want to be the person who picks?
Yeah.
Do you want to be the person who's an observer? Or I think the people who just joined, you want them to be observers, right, Rebecca?
I was thinking the people who, Paula and Laura, if you each were an observer in your room. However, I actually think you might be able to just play whatever role comes up, because there may be someone in the room who isn't able to do more than just listen right now. And so I want to honor that. Okay.
Okay.
All right. We're going to see you in a little bit. I'm opening the rooms. Okay. So how was that for everybody? Was that easy? No.
No.
But is this both rooms answering? I'm trying to see who was in both rooms. It was difficult. What was difficult for you? Can some people share out?
I can start. I think it was just the topic was difficult. It was a sensible topic, and there's so much tension right now, it's sort of intimidating to pick your words without offending or crossing a line, or I don't know, saying the wrong thing, I guess.
Yeah, that's a really common response to difficult conversations, is that fear, right? Of crossing that line, of offending. And then Mumfrey and I have been in a room. We were doing a lot of listening sessions after George Floyd was murdered in 2020. We did listening sessions in a business, and we had people who chose to just not answer our questions and sit in complete silence than talk at all, because they were so afraid to say the wrong thing. And that didn't get us anywhere, right? So I appreciate you bringing that up, Paula. Thank you. What else? What else was difficult? Has anyone had personal triggers from the conversation? You don't have to share them out. I'm just curious if you're feeling it personally, other than the fear of offending.
I think for me, what's happened, and I'm sorry to my group, and I appreciate my group, and I'm grateful for their patience with me, because I was the rambling one presenting an issue. And I think that what happened to me is, like, I've just been kind of attacked so many times this past two weeks, not personally, but my viewpoint in my workplace has been shut down a lot. And I can hold it when it's when it's me, but when I have students who I see struggling, or families who reach out to me not feeling represented, I feel like it's my responsibility to pass that along. But then if they don't want me to pass it along, we're in this space right now in my school where it's like, we want to make sure everybody's supported, so share names or share situations. And I don't want to share specifics, because if a family asks me not to share specifically that they're struggling, they're confiding in me. But then I'm supposed to, if I share that out with counselors, they want the names of the students, and then I'm breaking the trust that the family put in me, and so I'm struggling with that. So it was hard then to go in the breakout room and then really be vulnerable, because I'm just like, I feel so, I'm carrying a lot now. So that was hard for me, but I don't want to take up more space. I took up a lot of space in our room, but thank you for listening.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering if there's anyone in the room who wants to express anything. who was in the room with Laura. And again, chat is fine as well.
I appreciated all that Laura was sharing, and I think my struggle was to keep listening and to try, techniques that maybe are new to me. So I kept checking back on the script, and but I think in actual life, you have like the two don't align perfectly, like what people are saying and the circumstance and what the script, gives you. There's a lot of adjustments you have to make right on the spot. And I think that's kind of what our experience was in our breakout room, which, is just, that's the reality of it. And I think maybe being aware of what the bigger goal is, like to help Laura feel listened to and to encourage her to share as much as she wanted to or felt she needed to. Those were kind of the bigger picture issues. And so checking with the script and seeing, well, what's on there that I could use that could serve that bigger purpose. And I think maybe that's kind of the lesson I took from the breakout room.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, right? You're that struggle sometimes to stay listening can come from different places, whether it's a lot of empathy or if it's that it's bringing up something maybe of different feelings. But there's also something I'm hearing you say, and we say try to find that nugget that you of what they're saying that you can relate to. Some feeling that might be in there that you're hearing them share that you can relate to, even if everything they're talking about, you don't even agree. And sometimes that means the common ground in a dialogue is, oh, wow, we're all afraid right now. Oh, wow, we're all in pain right now, whatever it is, right? Paula.
Thank you. Yeah, about what you were saying, I was also responsible to inquire in the breakout room, and I experienced the same challenges, but at the same time, when you like something that went through my mind is when you identify something that you relate to, how to continue the conversation without imposing your opinion or your belief or your feelings, like not make it about you, but showing that you, I don't know, agree or disagree or relate in some way to the person you're inquiring to.
Yeah. And there's in the handout there's the Lara, which is, it sounds like you all are kind of leaning into a different tool that we use, which is listen actively, affirm feelings you're hearing and what the person's sharing, maybe reflect back what you're hearing, and then add. And then what we say is, in conflict, once you've done that, the person's going to feel much more seen and heard. They're going to be much more open then to hear whatever it is you're wanting to share about your perspective. So that's in there. Yeah, Kaylee.
I just wanted to comment as I was reflecting on your question of if anything was triggering for me, and now I'm realizing my entire conversation was a trigger response to the activity of having to pick sides to something. So the thing that I brought up was the current conflict in the Middle East. And now I'm realizing all of my comments that I was talking to Paula about was like, I'm feeling so much tension and confliction. Like I have to take a side in this conflict. And I feel like I can't. And for me, I see validity in opinion, but I also see extremity in action. And I just find myself in the space of I am an activist for protecting human life and for fostering love and and not violence.
but I'm feeling so much tension from my community, both those who I serve in my client base, but also my like family and my broader community here, to have a strong opinion about either side. And so I'm now realizing that this whole activity was a trigger response to me, and previous experiences of like family conflict and things like that, where I've been pressured to always have to have an opinion or a side about this conflict that's going on. And as a sociologist at heart, it's hard for me to ever feel like I fully understand the extent to which the conflict is taking place, because I'm not living it in. And so I feel like there will always be a story that's unheard on either side that I will discover at some point. So it's always, I find myself having a hard time picking sides on conflict, or feeling like I have to have my foot on one end or the other, when really I find myself a lot being that like fence person of like, I hear you and I hear you and I see validity in both. And anyways, so I think that's an interesting reflection of you bringing that up in me, of perhaps I have some digesting to do in terms of feeling an emotional response to having to have sides in conflict.
I just really appreciate you bringing that up. There's so much there about what you're saying, right? About why do you like who does it benefit when you're forced to pick a side, right? What's going on with debate culture? Like dialogue is about not looking at things as two-sided, right? Trying to find ways to understand and whose side is, if you see two sides in that conflict, whose two sides are you like, who are you talking about exactly? And there's actually a book called Between Two Armies about history in Guatemala that was really just meaningful to me personally, but it was about people being forced to pick a side, because it was, if you're not on one, then you're on the other, and being forced to fight against each other and so that was out of survival, that they didn't want any side of those sides, right? And so how are we on the side of human rights instead? Or how are we on the side, how do we look at it and step outside that box, or that social norm, or whatever's going on in our circles? Yeah. Sorry, there's a siren.
And we can keep processing. I'm just curious what other folks are thinking right now. What's going through your mind? And again, feel free to use the chat, or yeah, Paolo, keep.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking about what you were saying, and it's hard to pick a side, but at the same, I'm a human rights graduate student, and at the same time there's like certain responsibility of, well, you should be speaking up, or you should be doing something. Like, this is what you are studying, or what your professional responsibility is to actually be advocating or fighting for these things to stop happening. So I think personally, that's where I start to get torn between, you cannot just do nothing about it. And where do you start?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. And we talk in our intergroup dialogue, there's several stages that everyone goes through together over time. And one of the final stages, after we've really invested in each other and we've held a bunch of difficult conversations in terms of talking about hot topics, is then we talk about action. We talk about allyship, or being, sorry, there's barking here. Hopefully it's not too loud for you all, but being an accomplice, right? Whatever the term is, what are the risks, and what are the needs, and why I need to stand up, I need to do something. And my family, that's definitely been happening this past 2 weeks of my daughter, my mother, everyone is having this interesting awareness and having to interrupt a lot of tunnel vision, as how my daughter is putting it. And both both daughters processing feeling alone in their Jewishness, as they put it, because they have a much more strong human rights lens than some people around them, for example. And so it can be very painful, right? And it can be a physical risk for human rights activists. And so everyone's weighing that. Yeah, so I'm going to pause there. I want to Manpreet, I just want to check in with you. Do you want
I'm sorry. I think I'm hearing a lot of things that I just have some thoughts that I want to share. So one is with dialogue, with this particular framework of social justice that's couched in social justice education, intergroup dialogue that's research-based with over 35 years of evidence that shows that it works to promote intergroup relations, to promote understanding, to address deviations. We try to not come from a place where we have a goal in mind, and we truly try to listen and dialogue to understand each other's perspectives. And then there comes a time when it is really challenging, from if we think about it from a human rights perspective, or when you think about it from a resource perspective, right? Like Laura, you've been saying, oh, you've been asked share the names because they're going to get resources and then not wanting to share the names, or from personal things where you're forced to try to pick a side. We ask, what would it mean to just empathize and sit with empathy and listen? And we try to lean into multi-partiality. No one's born with a blank slate. None of us are a blank slate, right? My 10-month-old already is not a blank slate. We do have ideas. We do have biases. We talked about our privileges. So something that we didn't bring here, but I'd love for you all to look into more, and we'll add to the toolkit we'll share after, is how we know that being neutral is not a human rights perspective. There's no way that we can be neutral, especially in as a conflict as large as a genocide taking place, or humanitarian crisis taking place, or people being pulled out of their homes, or so many lives, innocent lives being taken. There's no neutrality. So what does it mean for us to be multi-partial? What does it mean, especially if we're trying to facilitate difficult conversations, to be multi-partial? So one of the tools that we do, and we can do a whole workshop on getting familiar with this tool, but it's to really practice multi-partiality in facilitation, which means I'm going to sit and I'm going to really empathize, and I'm going to learn, and I'm going to ask the critical questions and inquire, and always think about who's missing, right? Whose viewpoint is missing? How are we being critical? Whose viewpoint is missing? So those are just some thoughts that I have right now. And I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to go into like what we had planned for practicing a facilitation, or if you want to sit with this a little bit more, I'll follow your lead. But I'd love to also just hear thoughts from people, even in the chat, of what's going through your mind.
Yeah, I'd love to just hear what people are thinking right now. I can share my screen on free to keep going with the slides when we're ready. Just let me know. But it's a small group, so we can just keep talking for a moment.
I was just going to mention that I think that that's part of the difficulty with being a facilitator in these types of conversations, is trying to come in, not necessarily leave your opinions at the door, but allow space for your opinions to not bias the conversation. I think that that's where facilitating difficult conversations becomes very difficult, when you begin to feel your own emotions arise and your own opinions arise, and but then having to recheck with yourself that you're the facilitator in the conversation. And so navigating that emotional response, but also navigating what could also be like a moral response of like, I feel like I really need to say something here, but like you can't really. And so I don't know. I don't know how to navigate that in terms of facilitation in a practice-based way of how do I navigate when there are really extreme things being said or there's ouch happening across the board when I don't know if I'm kind of rambling, but I hope you see what I'm
Oh yeah. I mean,
saying.
yeah. I was just gonna say like a couple things. But the first question is, why do you think you can't say something?
Oh, sorry, I was gonna go grab my charger. I feel like sometimes as a facilitator, I feel I can't interject my opinion because I don't want to bias the conversation as a as the facilitator. Whereas if I felt like I was just invited to the conversation, that lens would change. So I don't know if that's wrong, but that's like just a feeling that I feel naturally, I guess, as the one bringing about the dialogue.
What
And
are
maybe
other
that's different on context, right? Like if it's just like me and somebody else, that's going to be a different conversation versus like I'm coming from the context of like I normally facilitate a little bit more of a group dialogue. Yeah.
Hmm.
I understand what Kaylee's saying because you know, a lot of the facilitation I do is in spaces where we're trying to learn. So you don't want to shut somebody down because they're revealing where they are in this journey, you know, and they say the wrong thing or they reveal that their their attention was on something that was, you know, not appropriate. And you know, I mean, you can, if you're the facilitator and you're calling those things out, well, I mean, there's a lot of tools that you can use that you don't have to necessarily call it out, but it is tricky to keep the door open for people to be vulnerable and to share in reality where they are, because they don't, you know, where they are, they're not conscious, they're not seeing it the way the facilitator is. They're in their own space, they're in their own lives, being who they are, and you're hoping to help them take, you know, the next step. So I don't know that, you know, I think that's one of the things that I balance, like, and one of the reasons I'm relating to what Kaylee's saying. And then another thing that makes it tricky is that in spaces where I'm facilitating, if something is revealed, I can say to myself, "Oh, she just revealed where she is on this journey." You know, I'm going to think about ways that we can, you know, address that. But in the meantime, everybody in the group's been exposed to that microaggression. So that goes back to something you brought up earlier about, you know, who else is in the space and how is it impacting them?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think sometimes as facilitators in intergroup dialogue, you'll hear, I mean, we've revealed a bit about ourselves. Manpreet shared a bit. I just revealed a bit about the politics in our house, probably a little bit, right? So there's moments where being vulnerable is something that you can model as well. So I don't have an answer, right or wrong, but just to say in the intergroup work we do, we really talk about that there's no neutral facilitator, that we all, like Manpreet was saying, we're all going to come in with our biases, and so the more we can own them, you know, and share them, and even make it so that people feel comfortable calling us in, you know, responding to us, the more we're holding that realistic, that interpersonal kind of relationship in an intergroup dialogue. And we also, just to add, have, you know, like I mentioned, we have 2 people at a time also for purposes like that, because sometimes it feels like, oh, I am too triggered by this. I don't know how I'm gonna respond. I'm gonna tap you on the shoulder, you know, like Zoom allows little private messaging or whatever. Though when we're in person, there's ways that, you know, we can signal to each other. And there are ways in which our dialogue facilitators, if they haven't worked together, will check in first to support each other for what they're going to need from each other as much as they can predict. But
Yeah, and I have, you know, we have some tools that we can share, and I have some things I can add to this. I'm curious if Nassim, Paula, or Laura, you have anything you want to add to this conversation? I know, Paula, you had also brought up the question of like What do you do if you really want to respond to something they're saying and you relate to it? Anything from other three of you?
I don't know why my image is freeze for me, at least this is what I see. I don't know. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, the voice works. In facilitation, sometimes it depends on the case, I guess, but if part of the conversation is marginalized for a long time and their voice hasn't been heard, I think that it's important to give them more space. It's not always equal. That's all.
I love that you're bringing that up. Thank you. I can give you an example if it's helpful. We do dialogues on homelessness. And we bring people who are housed and unhoused together. And I never fails that, like, it just last week, and I'm going to the dialogue after this. There's someone who will say, who takes a lot of space, and they talk and talk and talk, and people who've been in dialogue, they get housed people get frustrated because they're taking too much space. And what our group has processed is, but this person hasn't talked to anyone all day, right? They've been completely socially isolated. And so, and they're the expert in the room on the subject. And so there's ways in which, yeah, what we're talking about in terms of equal versus equity, right? And whose voices we make sure we privilege or uplift in a space really matters, right?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I think that's what I see as my responsibility as a facilitator, to kind of reflect on everything all of y'all have shared. I do see myself as modeling. So when there is something that I relate to someone, I can bring it up. I will bring it up, especially if I think it's going to further the dialogue. But I will stick to that, listen, affirm, inquire, and then I can respond or add or whatever I want to say, because I want to stay with that person. And then my role, how I see it as a multi-partial facilitator, is realizing that there are systems of oppression that are operating in every single group that I'm part of, which means I cannot be neutral, which means I need to do my work to be aware of my triggers, figure out how I can handle them or reuse a co-facilitation model and how to lean on someone else. And that also means that I'm aware of my own privileges. So there's two things as a multi-partial facilitator I can do. One is affirm the contributions from all group members. And I can do this while challenging some contributions more than others, depending on how they really uphold the dominant norms and narratives in society. Because the second thing is, I'm really partial to identities and perspectives that are not represented in the dialogue participant group. So by always being critical, who's missing, whose conversation isn't here, I can absolutely affirm. I can affirm with people that I hear or you're feeling, or you're, affirm something. But I can also ask critical questions and always be partial to the identities or perspectives that are not represented, that are missing. And this is just really, really hard. So I think one of the things I'll just personally share, I don't know what the other group's topic was, but it's just really hard. Like right before this, I was teaching, I teach undergrads, and, we just said the world's on fire. Like that's what it feels like right now. And we just processed together, and folks said different things. Folks were on different sides, right? But we can all empathize, we can all listen and affirm. And think from a human rights perspective, going back to Paula's perspective, I will communicate like what I am doing and give them actions to, whether that's to learn more, whether that's to explore more, think about the perspectives that are missing, ask themselves critical questions, or take action. And I will provide those resources as the facilitator. And it's just really hard. So that's the most I can do right now. What else is coming up for folks? other things you want to process.
I have a question for the group otherwise, but I want to see, does anyone else have something? Are you typing in the chat by chance? Any questions? Okay. I'd love to know if you could just share a little bit about who your supports are. What resources do you have to support you in the journey of holding difficult conversations? Because I know Laura brought that up of where it's very hard to find. So where do you have supports, or do you have questions about finding those supports, right?
Is that for the chat, or you want us to share out?
We love when we hear your voices, but you can do the chat as well.
I have a lot of supports. I just haven't had time to connect this later half of this week, but I do a lot of DEI work, and so I have my committee, co-committee members and my affinity space members, both in education and in my local community. So I have them to reach out, but it's like every meeting or every time we come together, we're going over this again. And so I just haven't been able to reach out on a personal level to share outside of meeting spaces, but I do have a good support group I'm really grateful for. And thank you to my small group that we were just in for their support too.
Thanks. Yeah. The people who are doing that work by your side. What else? Who else? It can be personal, professional. It can be people you know or don't know, right? There's a lot of different ways that we find support.
So part of a professional development, like leadership equity thing that I'm participating in right now, it's also very good to be participants while we're facilitators, like you all are right now. I've realized like that practice is really important. The facilitator in that group said, you don't even have to think about your professional supports, right? Who could talk to you about the conversations and all of those things. Who's your 3 a.m. friend? The person you can call at 3 a.m. and, doesn't have to be 3 a.m., but the person you can call and talk to. So for me, Rebecca's definitely been that this past couple of weeks. Even in some situations where I can't talk to my spouse about certain things, right? Because we'll disagree and it's too much to just listen.
I think for me, it's maybe a weird strategy, but my brother and I have very, very different points of views in terms, like even like political or social, or like in many different ways. We're very close, but at the same time, we disagree in almost everything. And for me, it is very useful to have these difficult conversations with him, who I love, but I don't really care what he thinks about me, in that sense of, I feel like there's enough respect for us to be completely transparent. And so I can have an open dialogue where I know I'm going to get a lot of counter arguments from him. And I sometimes even feel like he does it on purpose, just to like say whatever is against what I'm saying. But it's very useful for me to sort of make sense of why I believe something or why I want to do something, or sort of navigate those like different difficult conversations with someone that I know it's okay to say the wrong thing or like cross a line.
I
And
love
Kaylee
that.
saying siblings, yeah, Kaylee saying her siblings are the same. And I feel like I need to make that mind switch in my mind Because I feel like I've separated from my siblings because we're opposite, but you're right. I need to do that.
Yeah, I was going to bring up that same thing. I think it's beautiful that you two are invested enough in each other that that's the outcome isn't the polarization and separation, but you've really found that way to say, I'm going to stick with this with you and we're going to have these conversations. And maybe I'm doing it to poke at you a little bit, you know.
Yeah, I feel like most of the time he's poking at me, but it works for me.
And it's I always was terrified of debate. And it sounds like debate might not scare you. It doesn't scare my daughter. And I've always admired people who could handle that because disagreement did not go well in my household, right? Then it was silent treatments and things. So, you know, our upbringing and what we've experienced, it definitely influences, right? Like just to circle back to that exercise at the beginning we did about our relationship to conflict and disagreement, right? I am aware of the time, so I want to just take a moment and ask you all to just check out with us, to do a little closing moment with us. And just to ask you all if there's something right now, that a feeling or thought you're taking from this time together that's going to, you know, you're going to be reflecting on. And if you could just put it in the chat or share out loud. Just something you're reflecting on or a feeling you have right now. Navigating a new trigger, yeah. Nice. Thank you for that. A new trigger you didn't know you had. Those are always special. What else are people thinking about? Or just a one-word feeling is fine. I'm going to ask you another question. Yeah, go for it, Laura.
I was just going to say gratitude for the opportunity to be in community and share and grow. And I appreciate you all.
Thank you, Laura. In the chat, to avoid essentializing people and making them less than multidimensional. Thank you for that. Yeah. And maybe people are typing, but we want to ask you, sort of connected to what, oh, thank you. So building that support group, right? That you can share your thoughts and feelings with to deal with conversations. Yeah. You're not alone. You can always email us too. We'll give you our emails at the end. If you feel alone still, we are here for you. Is there, like, what's still missing? Like Manfred said at the beginning, you know, we start to talk about hard topics and then we're going to say goodbye to you within 2 hours. So, what might feel like it's still missing from the conversation? And if there's, and I'm going to give you a second one just in case. So what's missing, but also what might be a next step or an action that you're considering? Stepping into more practice. Thank you. That's from the missing, maybe wanting more practice, or from the.
That's my action piece. Like instead of avoiding conflict, right? I'm really good at, like, if I'm facilitating a conversation, I feel like I'm more confident, whether I'm better or good, really good or not. I feel like I'm doing an okay job. But when it comes up in interpersonal outside of, when I'm not in my professional role. I can do avoidance as much as I can until I feel really pressured to step in. And so I'm going to be more intentional about, hey, I'm here. Let's do this. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And I'll just throw in a check in with the person if this is when they want to have the conversation, because it comes up sometimes where find that person when they're available and open to the conversation. Otherwise, it makes it even more difficult. Discussing with those around me to develop a supportive space for dialogue in a non-professional space. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
Rebecca, do you mind putting up the slide 24?
Is that the self-care?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, we're on the same page, you and I. Okay, 1 second.
So I think regardless, like we ask you to think about your support, we ask you to try to really reflect on that because this is really hard work. It's hard work, whether it's in your personal relationships, parenting, the romantic relationship, or work, right? Professional facilitation. And self-care is just really, really hard to think about. So we want you to really think of, what's going to keep you going in this practice. So you don't have to look at the screen. You also don't have to participate. But I started the conversation with asking us to just, as a metaphor, like find your feet, really ground yourself, bring yourself in this moment, because our mind might be all over the place. Let's try to reconnect it with our body right now. So I'm going to ask us, feel free to turn off your video, feel free to participate just for the last minute we have. Engage in this self-care visualization with me, and I will turn off my video. You can do what feels best. And this is a self-care visualization by one of our board members, Sana Rahim. And it's inspired from her leadership coach, Nadia De Ala. Take one deep inhale and exhale. Release every ounce of air from your lungs. Relax your jaw. Relax your eyebrows. Roll your shoulders and relax your body. Now that you're centered and grounded, imagine a world where you are always well rested, energized, ready for everything your heart desires. Imagine waking up after a long, rejuvenating night of sleep. Visualize starting your day with a few deep breaths, checking in with yourself, noticing how you're feeling. Imagine moving from your bed to your bathroom, looking in the mirror and honoring what you see, being passionate with every single inch of yourself. Visualize nurturing and caring for yourself in the morning. What does caring for you look like? Where are you? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell and what do you feel? What does the world feel like after rest? What seems possible from this place of abundance? What are you holding inside of you that you can share after you've taken care of yourself? Rest is essential to your successes. So it's okay, friend. It's okay to rest. Think about all of your ancestors, your grandparents and their grandparents who worked relentlessly so that you could rest. Resting is a radical and revolutionary act for all. Repeat after me. I will not shame myself for resting. I will not shame myself for resting. I will not staying myself or resting. Thank you. Thank you for being here, for having this conversation with us. And we hope we can stay connected.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm going to say thank you, Manpreet, for taking us through that and noting in the chat from Kaylee all of the information about the next sessions coming up as well. So make sure to check on that. I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you all. Take care.